All right, so are you ready to dive into one of those legends that's just creepy and fascinating all at the same time? You know, like Bloody Mary. It's that classic setup, right? Dark room mirror, chanting a name, and maybe something terrifying shows up.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's amazing how a ritual that's like as simple as saying a name over and over can be so well known and scary. You know what I mean? And it's not even just that people are afraid of it or whatever. It's just that this legend makes people think about all the stuff we don't know and what might be out there just out of sight.
Right, and it's not just like a vague fear either.
Yeah.
You know, you can see a vengeful spirit covered in blood, or a ghost that tells you your future, or maybe even like lose your soul. I mean, those are some pretty intense possibilities that have kept people like thinking about this legend for a really long time.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Definitely the fact that it's so mysterious is a big part of why it's so appealing. But when we actually like look into the history of it, we find some real people who might have inspired this whole Bloody Mary thing. You mentioned Queen Mary I of England, right? Her reign was definitely not a peaceful time.
Oh yeah, Queen Mary I, who everyone calls Bloody Mary.
Yeah.
So what about her life do you think made her a possible, inspiration for this legend?
Well, okay, so picture England, like right in the middle of the Reformation. It was a super intense time for religion, a lot of upheaval and change. And Mary, she was a really devoted Catholic, and when she became queen, she was determined to make England Catholic again. And her methods were, well, let's just say they were pretty forceful. She had hundreds of Protestants burned at the stake, which is, why she got that nickname Bloody Mary. And that connection to violence and death, I mean, it's pretty obvious how that could be linked to this scary figure in the mirror, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a strong connection. But it's interesting though, right? Because some versions of the Bloody Mary legend, they also mention like a woman holding a baby or looking for a baby. Does that fit in with Queen Mary's story at all?
Yeah, it actually does. And it's kind of a sad story. Mary really wanted to have a child and heir, but she never did. There are actually historical records of her experiencing a phantom pregnancy, which, just added to the drama and sadness of her life. So this whole idea of wanting a child and maybe losing a child, it could have easily become part of the legend and changed into that stolen baby idea we see in some versions of the Bloody Mary story.
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating connection. It seems like real life tragedies and struggles for power can easily become, supernatural stuff in legends. But from what I've read, Queen Mary I isn't the only Mary who might be connected to this legend, right? Mm. There's also Mary Worth, although the information about her is a bit more mysterious.
Yeah. Mary Worth is definitely a much more mysterious figure. In fact, some people even think she might not have been a real person at all. Some sources describe her as a witch who kidnapped and killed children and used their blood for some kind of ritual to stay young. That definitely fits with those versions of the Bloody Mary legend where she steals your youth or hurts anyone who summons her.
It definitely makes the legend more cruel and dangerous. But it's interesting how that fear of getting old or losing your beauty keeps coming up. Do you think that reflects something that society is really anxious about, like maybe a fear of aging or losing your energy?
I think it definitely taps into those anxieties for sure. And it shows how powerful legends can be. They reflect our deepest fears of things that keep us up at night. But with Mary Worth, there's actually another version of her story that's even more disturbing. Some people believe she was involved in the reverse Underground Railroad, capturing and torturing escaped slaves.
Whoa, okay, that takes the legend to a whole other level of darkness. And it makes you wonder how real-life horrors can get mixed up with folklore like that. Can you explain a little bit about the reverse Underground Railroad for our listeners who might not know what that is?
Of course. So the Underground Railroad was this network of safe houses and routes to help slaves escape to freedom, right? But the reverse Underground Railroad, it was the opposite. It refers to this horrible practice of catching escaped slaves and returning them to their enslavers, often for money. It was usually extremely brutal and dehumanizing. And if Mary Worth was really involved in that, it makes her story even more sinister.
It's chilling to think how such a dark part of history could become part of a legend that we're still telling today. But from what you've researched, it seems like there's another historical figure who might have inspired the Bloody Mary myth. What can you tell us about Elizabeth Bathory?
Okay, so Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who lived in the 16th and 17th centuries. She became really infamous for being incredibly cruel. She was accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young women. The stories about her are really gruesome.
Hundreds. That's terrifying. But what makes her a possible inspiration for the Bloody Mary legend?
Well, the legend about Bathory claims that she bathed in the blood of her victims because she thought it would keep her young and beautiful. It's a shocking and disturbing image for sure, and the similarities to the Bloody Mary myth are pretty clear. Both figures are connected to blood and violence and this desperate desire to stay young.
It's incredible how this theme of blood and beauty seems to be in so many different cultures and time periods. It shows up in legends about Queen Mary, the First Mary Worth, and Elizabeth Bathory. What do you think it is about this specific combination that makes it so powerful and captivating for people?
I think it goes back to those primal fears we were talking about earlier. Like the fear of death, the fear of getting old, the fear of losing your vitality. These are fears that everyone has, and they've been around for centuries. And figures like Bloody Mary, they give those fears a face, a name, a story to tell.
Yeah, it's like these legends give us a way to actually deal with our fears, even if it's just through a scary story.
Mm-hmm.
But let's change gears for a second and talk about the ritual itself. Chanting a name into a mirror in a dark room. I mean, it's like something right out of a horror movie.
Oh, it totally is. And the crazy thing is how many different versions of this ritual there are. Some people say you got to chant Bloody Mary 13 times, but others say it's a different number, or they use different names like Hail Mary or Mary Worth. It's like the ritual has its own life now, It keeps changing.
Definitely makes it more mysterious. It makes you wonder what's going to happen. Do you think these different versions of the ritual tell us anything about how legends change over time as people tell them to each other?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like a game of telephone, but with spooky stories. Every time someone tells a story, they add something new, a little detail here and there, and eventually you end up with all these different versions of the same basic idea. But what's really interesting is that this idea of summoning something with a mirror isn't just in the Bloody Mary legend.
Right. I remember reading about that Japanese legend of Hanako-san, the ghost of a little girl who you can summon in school bathrooms. It's a totally different culture, but the ritual also uses a mirror and a chant.
Exactly. And even though the details are different, both Hanako-san and Bloody Mary use this idea that mirrors are like portals to another world, and that's something people are scared of. Mirrors show us our reflection, but they can also mess with how we see things, make us see things that aren't there, and make us question what's real and what's not.
It's like they can show you things, but also hide things, which makes these legends even more creepy. And speaking of the psychology of it all, I was really interested to learn about how people used the Bloody Mary ritual to talk about social issues back in the 1990s.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Think about it. You're alone in a dark room, chanting at a mirror and waiting for something maybe violent or judgmental to appear. It becomes this really powerful metaphor for being vulnerable, for facing your fears, and for what might happen if you break social rules.
It's like the legend became a mirror, reflecting all the anxieties and fears of that time. I read that people use the ritual to talk about things like racism and sexual violence, sexism, and the pressure to fit in.
That's right. The ritual gave people a safe space, even though it was a creepy one, to talk about these difficult things and explore how they felt about them. And it shows how legends can change and adapt to reflect what people are worried about in different generations. They're not just stories that stay the same, they change along with our culture.
That's such a powerful way to think about it. So we've got these possible real-life Marys, a ritual based on ancient beliefs about mirrors, and a legend that keeps changing and reflecting what society is worried about. It's almost like Bloody Mary is a shapeshifter, always changing based on our fears and what we find fascinating.
And that's exactly why she's so interesting and why people keep talking about her. But aside from the scary stuff and the historical connections, I think there's a bigger question we need to ask. What does Bloody Mary, in all her different forms, tell us about ourselves?
That's a great question. Why are we so drawn to these stories about the unknown? Why do we keep coming back to these glimpses into a world we don't understand?
Well, part of it might be that we're just curious, We want to push the limits of what we know and explore the mysteries around us. It's like this basic urge to understand the things that shape our world, even the things that don't seem to make sense.
I totally get that. And there's also that feeling of excitement. That adrenaline rush that comes with facing your fears, even if it's just through a story or a ritual. It's like we're testing ourselves to see how much we can handle before we get too scared.
That's a really interesting point. It's like we're facing our fears in a safe way, sort of like a roller coaster for your mind. We get the thrill of the unknown without actually being in danger. But I also think there's something deeper going on here. Maybe it's that we want something more than just everyday life, a desire to connect with something supernatural, to believe that there's more to this world than what we can see and touch.
I think you're right. We're always looking for meaning, purpose, and connection in our lives. And legends like Bloody Mary give us the glimpse into a world where those things are like super intense and maybe even supernatural.
And it's not just about believing passively, it's about actually doing something. The ritual itself is a way of interacting with the unknown, of testing the limits of reality, and seeing if maybe, just maybe, there's something else out there waiting to be discovered.
It's like we're inviting the mystery into our lives, daring it to show itself. And that feeling of being in control, of being a part of the experience, makes it even more interesting.
Exactly. It's not just about hearing a story, it's about becoming part of the story, even if it's just for a short time. And because the legend can be interpreted in so many ways, everyone can see their own fears and desires in Bloody Mary. She represents all of our anxieties, but she's also a mirror reflecting our individual hopes and dreams.
That's a really great way to put it. But if Bloody Mary is a reflection of our fears, what does her image in the mirror tell us about the specific fears of each generation? What might she represent to us today in the 21st century?
That's something to think about, isn't it? In the past, she might have represented the fear of religious persecution, the unknown dangers lurking in the dark, or the fear of losing your innocence in youth. But what about now? What anxieties and uncertainties are we facing in our modern world?
Well, we live in a time where we're bombarded with information all the time. We're constantly hearing about global crises, political divisions, and social unrest. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and powerless when faced with such huge problems.
You're absolutely right. And that feeling of being powerless, of not being able to control things, that's something that might make Bloody Mary relevant today. Maybe she represents that fear of losing your voice in a world that feels so chaotic and unpredictable.
Or maybe she represents the fear of technology and how it could be used to manipulate us, invade our privacy, or create a fake reality that we can't escape from. It's like the mirror itself symbolizes the screens. We're always looking at the digital reflections that shape how we see the world and how we act.
That's a really interesting connection. The mirror, which used to be a symbol of vanity and looking at yourself, has now become like a doorway to this massive and sometimes overwhelming digital world. And just like those old legends, the stories we see online can be good and bad. They can show us truth and beauty, but they can also be twisted and manipulative.
It's almost like the legend of Bloody Mary has a whole new meaning in our digital world. The fear of the unknown hasn't disappeared. It's just become something sneakier, more widespread, and harder to pin down.
Yeah, it really is amazing how this legend that's been around for like centuries can still feel so relevant to what we're worried about today. But in a way, isn't that what makes legends so powerful? They tap into these like universal fears and anxieties that go beyond time and technology. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And just like those anxieties change, the legend changes too, right? It's always reflecting our deepest fears, our cultural obsessions, and our never-ending search for the unknown.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Bloody Mary legend, what are some of the main things you hope our listeners are taking away from this? Well, I think it's super important to remember that legends like this are more than just scary stories, you know? They give us a glimpse into the human mind, our shared history, and how powerful storytelling can be. We've gone from Queen Mary I and her fiery reign to the mysterious tales of Mary Worth and the gruesome legend of Elizabeth Bathory. And the really interesting thing is how each of these figures, real or not, contributed to a legend that has lasted for so long and spread across different cultures.
It's like this tapestry woven from history, folklore, and psychology, where each thread adds a new layer of meaning and makes it even more complex. But even with all the information we've uncovered, there's still this sense of mystery at the heart of the legend.
And that's part of why we keep coming back to these stories, isn't it? The unanswered questions, the possibility that something unknown is out there. Legends like Bloody Mary remind us that even with all our progress and knowledge, there are still mysteries that we may never fully solve.
It's a humbling thought, for sure, but it's also a reminder that there's still a sense of wonder and awe to be found in the world. So what would you say to our listeners who might be having second thoughts about chanting Bloody Mary into a mirror?
I'd say go for it, be curious, but also be respectful. Remember that this legend reflects all of our fears and anxieties. What you see in the mirror might be more than just your reflection. It might be a glimpse into the heart of a legend, a whisper from the past, and a reminder of how stories can both scare us and fascinate us at the same time.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. And at the end of the day, whether you believe in the supernatural or just enjoy a good spooky story, there's no denying how powerful the Bloody Mary legend is. It's a story that continues to haunt us and fascinate us, reminding us of the darkness and the light that exists within us all. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Bloody Mary. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep searching for those stories that help us understand what it means to be human.